He was a tap legend who traded laughs with Sinatra and the president. Yet to survive Hollywood's golden cage, Sammy Davis Jr. danced until his bones crumbled and smiled through relentless humiliation. Branded a traitor by his own people, driven into addiction, and left to die $15 million in debt, this is how the ultimate entertainment machine methodically crushed its greatest genius. The foundation of this lifelong psychological tragedy was laid early. Born into a traveling vaudeville family, young Sammy never had a childhood. He had a survival strategy. Touring the segregated Chitlin circuit during the Great Depression, he learned a brutal foundational lesson. His value as a human being was strictly tied to his ability to entertain. Applause was not a luxury for his ego. It was the literal currency keeping a roof over his head. This transactional existence was violently reinforced when he was drafted into the deeply segregated U.S. Army during WWII. Beaten and physically humiliated by white soldiers in his own barracks, Sammy realized his fists couldn't save him. So, he danced, he sang, he made his abusers laugh. Every time he executed a perfect routine, he secured another day without a broken bone. He returned from the war a hardened prodigy who understood his devastating reality. The moment he stopped tap dancing, the applause would instantly revert to hatred. He had learned to barter his dignity for safety, laying the groundwork for the most spectacular invisible cage the entertainment industry had ever seen. Stepping out of the military uniform and back into his tap shoes in 1945, Sammy Davis Jr. returned to a rapidly changing America. The Will Mastin Trio was back on the road, but the dynamics had irrevocably shifted. Sammy was no longer just the young prodigy anchoring the act. He was a hardened survivor who understood that his talent was the only currency that mattered. The trio began to break out of the grueling, low-paying, segregated circuits, inching their way into more prestigious, white-dominated venues. A crucial turning point arrived when Frank Sinatra, who had met a young Sammy years earlier and recognized his immense potential, insisted that the Will Mastin Trio open for him at the Capitol Theater in New York. Sinatra was an undisputed titan of the industry, and his endorsement acted as a powerful shield. When Sammy stepped onto that stage, he unleashed a kinetic energy that left audiences entirely breathless. He danced with a frantic, desperate brilliance. He mimicked the biggest stars of the day with uncanny precision. He sang with a deeply bruised, soulful resonance that belied his young age. The white establishment was completely captivated. He was quickly becoming the most electrifying live performer in the country, a human dynamo who could single-handedly command a room. This meteoric rise inevitably brought him to the gleaming neon-lit oasis rising out of the Nevada desert, Las Vegas. In the early 1950s, Las Vegas was rapidly transforming into the undisputed entertainment capital of the world. It was a city built on extravagance, a playground for the wealthy, the powerful, and the organized crime syndicates that quietly funded the lavish casinos. The Will Mastin Trio, fueled by Sammy's explosive talent, became a marquee attraction. They drew massive crowds to the El Rancho Vegas and the Frontier. The money began to flow in unprecedented amounts. Sammy was suddenly generating tens of thousands of dollars a week, securing a level of financial wealth that was virtually unimaginable for a black man at that time. He began to dress in impeccably tailored suits, driving expensive cars, projecting an image of total, unassailable success. To the casual observer, he had conquered the system. He had broken through the racial ceiling to stand shoulder to shoulder with the elite. Yet behind the shimmering neon facade, Las Vegas was widely known among Black Americans as the Mississippi of the West. The city enforced a brutal, unyielding system of racial segregation. This created the most agonizing paradox of Sammy's life. He was the undisputed king of the showroom. His name in massive glowing letters on the marquee outside was the primary reason thousands of tourists flocked to the casino. He generated immense wealth for the hotel owners, but the moment his show ended, the rules of the segregated South immediately applied. He was strictly forbidden from walking through the casino floor. If he wanted to gamble, he was denied a seat at the tables he helped subsidize. He was completely banned from the hotel restaurants and barred from swimming in the guest pool. Most humiliating of all, despite being the highest paid entertainer in the building, he was not permitted to rent a room. After performing to standing ovations from wealthy audiences, Sammy was regularly escorted by security guards through the kitchen. He generated immense wealth for the casinos, yet remained legally barred from their amenities. The system valued the product he manufactured, but segregated the man who created it. This daily humiliation intensified his profound internal crisis. He was trapped in a state of constant, exhausting cognitive dissonance. He was adored by millions, yet treated like an outcast by the very people paying his salary. To cope, he adopted an aggressive, almost frantic persona off stage. He began to desperately overcompensate. He threw his money around wildly, buying expensive gold jewelry and custom-made suits, trying to physically wear the wealth that he hoped would command respect. He laughed too loudly at the casino boss's jokes. He went out of his way to be exceptionally accommodating, terrified that if he showed even a hint of the deep simmering anger inside him, the doors to the showrooms would slam shut forever. He was acutely aware that he was entirely replaceable in the eyes of the white establishment. He was walking a microscopic tightrope, trying to maintain his status as a non-threatening, perpetually happy entertainer, while his soul was being methodically crushed by the daily indignities of the freight elevator. He generated immense wealth for the casinos, yet remained legally barred from their amenities. The system valued the product he manufactured, but strictly segregated the man who created it. To cope, he adopted an aggressive, almost frantic persona off stage, throwing money around and laughing too loudly at the casino boss's jokes, terrified that if he showed any simmering anger, the showroom doors would slam shut forever. But the true lethality of his golden cage was about to be revealed when he dared to step over Hollywood's invisible electric red line. By 1957, Sammy Davis Jr. had seemingly conquered the insurmountable. He had returned from the edge of death, his eye patch now a global symbol of resilience and raw survival. He was earning upwards of $10,000 a week, a staggering fortune for the era. He confidently walked through the doors of the most exclusive nightclubs in Los Angeles, cloaked in the immensely powerful protective aura of Frank Sinatra and the emerging Rat Pack. For a brief, intoxicating moment, he allowed himself to believe the deafening applause had finally drowned out the prejudice. He believed he had become too big, too profitable, and too universally beloved to be touched by the archaic, vicious racial rules of America. He felt perhaps for the first time in his life truly invincible. But the golden cage had not vanished. Its bars had simply been painted to blend in with the glamorous horizon. There remained an invisible electric red line drawn strictly across the floor of American society, and Sammy, fueled by a dangerous mixture of genuine love and newfound confidence, was about to step directly over it. Her name was Kim Novak. In the late 1950s, she was not just an actress. She was an incredibly valuable corporate asset. With her platinum blonde hair, breathy voice, and undeniable hypnotic magnetism, she was the undisputed crown jewel of Columbia Pictures. She had been meticulously groomed and heavily aggressively marketed by the studio to replace Rita Hayworth as the ultimate American sex symbol. But to Columbia Pictures and its ruthless mogul Harry Cohn, Novak was not a human being. She was a highly protected multi-million-dollar corporate asset. And in the fiercely segregated climate of 1957 America, the absolute worst thing that could possibly happen to a white female investment was to be publicly associated with a black man. Sammy and Kim met at a bustling, crowded Hollywood party. Beneath the superficial champagne-soaked glamour, they quickly recognized a profound, shared tragedy in each other. Sammy was the brilliant prodigy trapped by the system's racial hypocrisy. Kim was the working-class girl trapped by Harry Cohn's misogynistic, suffocating control. They were both exquisite birds in different cages, owned by an industry that relentlessly consumed their true identities. A fierce, deeply passionate romance ignited almost immediately. It was a terrifyingly dangerous secret. They could not be seen at restaurants. They could not attend glittering film premieres together. They were forced to meet in the shadows like criminals. They borrowed friends' houses in the remote Hollywood hills, sneaking through back doors under the cover of darkness. The greatest entertainer in the world would hide curled up on the floorboards of cars, covered by a blanket, just to safely visit the woman he loved. For a few stolen hours at a time, away from the popping flashbulbs and the watchful eyes of the studio bosses, they found a desperate, quiet solace in one another. For Sammy, this was intensely personal, but it was also something more. It was a subconscious rebellion. It was a defiant, desperate belief that his phenomenal success, his sheer undeniable genius, had finally earned him the fundamental human right to love whoever he chose. But in Hollywood, secrets are just highly volatile currency waiting to be spent. The whispers began in the leather-backed booths of Romanoffs and Chasins. Then, an infamous, utterly ruthless gossip publication called Confidential Magazine caught the scent. The magazine began preparing to publish a massive, devastating expose detailing the interracial affair. The mere rumor of the impending article sent a shockwave of absolute cold sweat panic through the executive suites of Columbia Pictures. The impending scandal threatened Columbia Pictures' bottom line. The southern United States was a massive, lucrative market, and a boycott over an interracial affair could cost the studio millions of dollars overnight. Harry Cohn was entirely apoplectic. The very foundation of his empire was being threatened by an unauthorized romance, and he was a man who did not tolerate threats. Cohn did not call a meeting with his publicists to manage the fallout. He did not issue a polite warning through lawyers. Harry Cohn picked up the telephone and called his deep associates in the Chicago underworld. This is the chilling, often heavily sanitized reality of the golden age of Hollywood. The dazzling studio system was deeply, inextricably linked with organized crime. Cohn reached out to notorious violent mobsters, men who controlled the labor unions, the nightclubs, and the dark, blood-soaked underbelly of the city. He put out an open contract on Sammy Davis Jr. The message was not delivered through polite intermediaries. It was delivered with the cold, blunt force of a sledgehammer. According to multiple historical accounts and later confessions from those involved, armed, terrifying enforcers affiliated with the mob tracked Sammy down. They cornered him, stripping away every single ounce of his celebrity armor in a matter of seconds. The ultimatum delivered to Sammy was medieval in its calculated cruelty. The mobsters looked the highest-paid entertainer in the world directly in his one good eye and laid out his options. He was to completely, entirely, and permanently sever all contact with Kim Novak immediately. If he refused, if he even looked in her direction again, they promised they would break both of his legs with baseball bats, ensuring he would never tap dance another step for the rest of his life. If that wasn't enough to deter him, they promised to track him down and violently gouge out his remaining eye, plunging him into permanent, inescapable darkness. And if he still somehow defied them after that, they would simply murder him and bury him in the desert. There was no negotiation, there was no appeal process. The immense power of his best friend Frank Sinatra could not save him from this level of organized wrath. His millions of dollars in the bank could not buy off the hitmen. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone. When the mob enforcers delivered their ultimatum, the protective shield of his celebrity instantly vaporized. The brutal threat made it explicitly clear that despite his immense wealth, tailored suits, and powerful friends, he held no real power against the industry's ruthless establishment. To the men who truly ran the system, he was nothing more than a black man who had forgotten his place. The system had graciously allowed him to earn a fortune. It had clapped for his songs, but it had never, not for a single fraction of a second, granted him equality or basic human rights. His entire life's work, the grueling, hungry childhood on the road, the vicious beatings in the army, the thousands of hours perfecting his craft until his feet bled, none of it meant anything against the violent, racist, capitalistic machinery of the establishment. He was backed into a terrifying, suffocating corner. He had to make an agonizing choice between his heart and his physical existence. The golden cage had suddenly shrunk with terrifying speed, its cold iron bars pressing directly against his throat, forcing him to make the most humiliating, soul-crushing decision of his entire life, simply to survive the week. The air in his luxurious penthouse suite suddenly felt unbreathable. Following the terrifying encounter with the mob enforcers dispatched by Harry Cohn, Sammy Davis Jr. was left entirely alone to process the absolute devastating reality of his situation. The men who had threatened to blind him and break his legs were not idle gossips. They were the brutal, invisible architects of the American entertainment industry. They had made it chillingly clear that simply promising to never see Kim Novak again was insufficient. The Columbia Pictures executives and their underworld associates required concrete, public, and immediate proof that their blonde investment was untainted by a black entertainer. They demanded a spectacle to counter the impending scandal. Sammy was ordered to find a black woman and marry her instantly to provide an airtight alibi. It was a hostage situation disguised as a Hollywood romance. The most famous, dynamic performer on the planet, a man who commanded standing ovations from presidents and royalty, was now being forced into a sham marriage simply to retain the right to physically walk, see, and breathe. The clinical, desperate search for a bride began. There was no time for courtship. This was a high-stakes corporate acquisition to save his life. The system required a willing participant, someone who understood the transactional nature of show business and could play the role convincingly for the cameras. Enter Lori White. She was a 23-year-old singer and dancer who worked at the Silver Slipper Casino in Las Vegas. She had briefly dated Sammy in the past, a casual acquaintance that barely registered as a romance. She was a working-class black woman trying to navigate the same unforgiving, segregated industry. When Sammy's representatives, driven by sheer panic, approached her with the proposition, it was presented devoid of any romantic illusion. It was a stark, cold contract. In exchange for marrying Sammy Davis Jr. and posing as his devoted wife for exactly 1 year, she would receive a lump sum payment of $10,000, a life-altering amount of money for a black casino worker in 1958. She would also gain temporary access to the highest echelons of celebrity wealth. Understanding the brutal economics of their world, Lori White agreed. She was not a villain in this narrative. She was simply another marginalized performer making a pragmatic survivalist choice within a rigged system. The wedding was hastily arranged for January the 10th, 1958. The cruel irony of the location was inescapable. The ceremony took place in the Emerald Room of the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas, the very city that still forced Sammy to enter through the kitchen and forbade him from swimming in the pools. Now, the casino bosses were facilitating his wedding because it served the broader protective interests of the white entertainment monopoly. The guest list was a surreal, glittering collection of the Hollywood elite. Frank Sinatra was there. The ceremony was heavily covered by the press, with flash bulbs popping to capture the seemingly joyous occasion. Harry Belafonte, a man deeply committed to the civil rights movement and a close friend of Sammy's, stood as his best man. Belafonte, who fiercely guarded his own dignity against the racist machinations of the industry, stood beside Sammy at the altar, bearing witness to what he privately knew was an absolute soul-crushing capitulation to white supremacy. If you look closely at the archival photographs from that day, beneath the forced smiles and the elegant tuxedo, Sammy Davis Jr. looks entirely hollowed out. He was heavily intoxicated. Throughout the ceremony and the lavish reception that followed, he drank with a frantic, desperate intensity, trying to anesthetize the profound humiliation of the moment. He was performing the most intimate, sacred human ritual, not out of love, but out of sheer terror. He was putting on the performance of a lifetime, acting the part of the ecstatic groom for the reporters, knowing that every smile, every kiss for the cameras was a lie dictated by men who viewed him as nothing more than property. He had spent his entire life dancing to buy love from the audience, but now he was explicitly buying a wife to save his own life. The golden cage had never been more visible. It was wrapped in wedding tulle and paid for in blood money. The facade crumbled the moment the press left and the suite doors closed. Stripped of the cameras, the reality of his submission set in. According to accounts from his inner circle, the wedding night devolved into a severe psychological break. Driven by absolute despair and heavy intoxication, his breakdown escalated to the point of self-harm. It required the physical intervention of his friends, Arthur Silber and Mickey Rooney, to restrain him until he collapsed from exhaustion. He survived the night, but the naive hope that his talent could ever buy his freedom died permanently in that Las Vegas penthouse. For the next 12 months, Sammy and Lori lived a grotesque double life. They were forced to perform their marriage for the public. They posed for the covers of major black publications like Ebony and Jet magazines. The black press, entirely unaware of the mafia threats and the studio orchestration, celebrated the union. They hailed it as a beautiful, stabilizing moment for one of their most prominent stars. The bitter, agonizing irony of this was a heavy burden for Sammy to carry. He was being celebrated by his own people for a marriage that was actually the ultimate symbol of his subjugation by the white establishment. Behind closed doors, there was no romance. They largely lived entirely separate lives. Lori enjoyed the financial comfort the contract provided, attending parties and buying expensive clothes, while Sammy threw himself violently into his work, traveling relentlessly, taking on exhausting schedules just to avoid being alone in the same house with the physical reminder of his own cowardice and powerlessness. He worked to the point of sheer exhaustion, punishing his body on stage because the stage was still the only place he felt he had any control over his own destiny. The charade lasted exactly as long as the contract stipulated. In early 1959, the divorce was quietly finalized. The danger had passed. Kim Novak's career at Columbia was secure, Harry Cohn was satisfied, and the underworld enforcers retreated back into the shadows. Lori White took her settlement and faded from the glaring spotlight, a temporary ghost hired to haunt Sammy's life for a year. The studio system breathed a collective sigh of relief, content that the machinery had functioned perfectly to protect its white assets. Sammy was legally free once again, but the psychological scars of the 1958 sham marriage were permanent. He emerged from the divorce with a terrifying, crystal-clear understanding of the American power structure. He realized that talent, no matter how extraordinary, was fundamentally useless without proximity to real institutional power. He understood that being the most popular entertainer in the world meant absolutely nothing if a studio boss could still order a hit on you with a single phone call. This terrifying realization triggered a massive shift in his strategy for survival. He decided that if he could never truly be an equal, he would have to become so deeply embedded in the absolute highest echelons of power that they could never threaten him again. He would not just be an entertainer. He would become indispensable to the kings. He threw himself entirely into the brotherhood of the Rat Pack, cementing his bond with Frank Sinatra, a man who possessed the kind of ruthless, untouchable power Sammy desperately craved. And, even more dangerously, he turned his sights toward Washington. He began to believe that the only shield strong enough to protect him from the Harry Cohns of the world was the President of the United States. He was about to leverage all of his fame, all of his energy, and the last remnants of his fractured identity to buy his way into the ultimate center of white power, the Kennedy political dynasty. He was walking out of a fabricated marriage and stepping directly into a political machine that would prove to be infinitely more manipulative and ultimately far more devastating to his soul. The 1960s shattered his remaining illusions. Sammy believed his unparalleled fame, his marriage to white actress Mae Britt, and his tireless fundraising for John F. Kennedy's presidential campaign had finally bought him a seat at the table of power. But days before the 1961 inaugural gala, the Kennedy administration ruthlessly disinvited him. To appease racist Southern politicians, the president he helped elect erased him. He wasn't a political player. He was a disposable token. Desperate to prove he wasn't a political discard, a deeply wounded Sammy made the most catastrophic miscalculation of his life. In 1972, seeking validation from the very establishment that mocked him, he publicly embraced conservative President Richard Nixon on stage. The infamous photograph of that hug destroyed his credibility overnight. When he stepped onto the stage at the Push Expo in Chicago weeks later, the audience of thousands of Black Americans didn't applaud. They booed him relentlessly. The psychological terror he had feared since childhood, the total absence of applause, had finally materialized, administered by his own people. He wept openly on stage, fundamentally broken. Excommunicated by his community and used as a prop by the white establishment, the isolation was absolute. His ego didn't just crack, it pulverized. To numb the agonizing reality that he belonged absolutely nowhere, Sammy retreated into a dark, chemically induced cycle of cocaine and bourbon, desperately paying a massive entourage to surround him so he wouldn't have to die in silence. He owed money to the casinos, he owed money to banks, and, most dangerously, he began to fall severely behind on his obligations to the federal government. The industry watched his slow-motion collapse with a cold, detached pragmatism. The studio bosses and casino owners, who had previously hailed him as a genius, did not offer rehabilitation or genuine support. They simply adjusted his contracts, they lowered his guarantees. They moved him from the main showrooms of the premium hotels to the secondary lounges of the fading casinos. The system was meticulously recalculating his value as his physical and emotional health degraded. He was no longer the undisputed king of entertainment. He was becoming a tragic nostalgia act, a cautionary tale playing out in real time under the neon lights. The golden cage was rusting rapidly, its bars closing in tighter with every passing year, preparing for the final ruthless extraction of whatever value he had left to offer. The harsh corporate reality of the 1980s arrived with a cold, unforgiving light, completely illuminating the wreckage of Sammy Davis Jr.'s life. The era of the Rat Pack, with its velvet-roped exclusivity and cigarette smoke glamour, was entirely dead. The entertainment industry had mutated into a highly systematized, youth-obsessed, blockbuster-driven machine. It was the decade of MTV, of synthesized pop music, and heavily packaged teenage idols. In this rapidly shifting landscape, Sammy Davis Jr. was suddenly an anachronism. He was a man in his late 50s, but his physical body carried the brutal, grinding mileage of a man decades older. He had been dancing on hard wooden stages, concrete floors, and improvised platforms since he was 3 years old. The sheer repetitive physical trauma had completely decimated his joints. His hips were grinding bone on bone, producing an agonizing, continuous pain that no amount of prescription medication could fully mask. His lungs were heavily compromised from a lifetime of chain-smoking 4 packs of cigarettes a day, a habit he had adopted as a teenager to soothe his chronic anxiety. Yet the Golden Cage does not offer a pension plan. The system is designed to extract value until the machinery completely breaks down. Sammy could not stop working. He could not retreat to a quiet retirement because the financial structure he had built around himself was a terrifying, precarious house of cards, and a massive hurricane was gathering just off the horizon. The millions of dollars he generated annually were vanishing the exact moment they entered his bank accounts. This was not merely the result of a celebrity buying too many expensive cars. It was the result of a highly parasitic ecosystem that had aggressively attached itself to him. His massive entourage had evolved into a permanent, immovable payroll. He was financially supporting dozens of people, managers, security personnel, musical directors, wardrobe assistants, and an ever-rotating cast of sycophants who offered nothing but hollow praise. He was terrified of the silence of an empty house, so he essentially paid these people a premium salary to pretend to be his family. They lived in his mansions, they drank his expensive liquor, and they traveled first class on his dime. Behind the scenes, the managerial class surrounding him was executing a masterclass in financial exploitation. They knew his psychological vulnerabilities intimately. They knew he was entirely functionally illiterate when it came to financial documents. Sammy never looked at a ledger. He never questioned an invoice. He simply signed the checks that were pushed in front of him, trusting that the men he employed were protecting his interests. They were not. They were funneling his earnings into disastrous, highly speculative investments, many of which were designed as tax shelters that the federal government was rapidly beginning to investigate and dismantle. This financial negligence birthed an invisible, devastating monster, the Internal Revenue Service. Throughout the late 1970s and into the 80s, the IRS began a meticulous, relentless audit of his finances. They discovered years of unpaid taxes, disallowed deductions, and massive penalties. The debt began to compound at a terrifying rate. The government did not care about his childhood trauma, his contributions to the civil rights movement, or his cultural legacy. They only saw a ledger written in red ink. The debt quietly ballooned from hundreds of thousands of dollars into the millions. His accountants, desperate to keep the gravy train running and terrified of delivering the catastrophic news, largely shielded him from the absolute severity of the situation. They adopted a strategy of panicked appeasement, forcing Sammy to take on more and more grueling tour dates just to generate the liquid cash needed to make the minimum penalty payments. This financial desperation forced Sammy into a deeply humiliating artistic compromise. He needed money instantly, constantly, and in massive quantities. He could no longer afford to be selective about his projects. The man who had once commanded the main showroom of the Sands Hotel, a man who possessed a baritone voice that could rival Sinatra's, began to reduce himself to a caricature just to collect a paycheck. He became a fixture on daytime television talk shows and low-budget celebrity roast specials. He agreed to awkward, often demeaning cameo appearances in television sitcoms and films, where the entirety of the joke was simply his sudden, out-of-place presence. He would walk onto a television set, heavily draped in thick gold chains, wearing oversized, flamboyant glasses, and loudly deliver his old catchphrases. The studio audiences would applaud, but it was a nostalgic, slightly pitying applause. They were clapping for the memory of the entertainer he used to be, not the exhausted, physically broken man standing before them. He was actively participating in the public dismantling of his own dignity. He knew the television appearances were beneath his immense talent, but the IRS demands were absolute. He was a prisoner working on a chain gang, forced to tap dance and smile to pay off a debt he didn't even fully comprehend. The physical toll of this relentless schedule was horrifying. Behind the heavy stage makeup, his face was gray and deeply lined with sheer exhaustion. The chronic pain in his hips became so severe that his team had to design special padded stools for the stage so he could sit down during his vocal numbers. The legendary tap dancing routines, once a blur of kinetic genius, were drastically shortened and painfully modified. The tragic reality was that the stage, which had served as his only true sanctuary since he was a toddler, was rapidly transforming into an instrument of torture. Before every single performance, he required a heavily orchestrated medical routine just to physically stand up. Doctors were brought into his dressing rooms to administer cortisone injections directly into his ruined joints. He washed down handfuls of painkillers with glasses of bourbon. He would sit in a chair, trembling from the pain and the chemical cocktail coursing through his veins, right up until the exact second the stage manager called his name. Then, a chilling, almost mechanical transformation would occur. The instinct forged in the brutal Wyoming Army barracks would take over. He would force his shoulders back, plaster a massive, brilliantly white smile across his face, and step out into the blinding spotlight. For 90 minutes, he would completely ignore the agonizing pain in his bones, delivering a performance fueled entirely by raw adrenaline and absolute desperation. The moment the curtain fell, the illusion instantly collapsed. He would hobble off the stage, heavily leaning on his bodyguards, his breathing ragged, his bespoke tuxedo soaked in sweat. He was routinely carried to his dressing room sofa, unable to take another step. This was the brutal, untelevised reality of the Golden Cage. The industry executives and the casino bosses watched this physical deterioration with a chilling, calculated detachment. They saw the medical interventions. They saw the limping. They knew he was heavily addicted to narcotics and alcohol. Yet, not a single powerful figure in the entertainment industry intervened to offer him a reprieve or genuine help. They simply calculated how many more profitable tours they could squeeze out of his deteriorating frame before he finally collapsed entirely. They adjusted their insurance policies and booked the next string of dates. His deep, crushing loneliness intensified during this period. The sycophants continued to populate his living room, drinking his liquor and laughing loudly at his jokes. But Sammy was no longer under any illusions about their loyalty. The agonizing realization had finally set in. He was entirely alone in a crowded room. He knew that the people smiling at him were actually looking directly at his wallet. The psychological burden of this knowledge was immense. He was a man who possessed an infinite capacity for love, a man who had desperately sought connection his entire life, yet he found himself in his twilight years completely surrounded by mercenaries. He could not fire them because firing them would mean facing the terrifying absolute silence of an empty house. He chose the pain of financial exploitation over the terror of isolation. In 1987, his physical body simply refused to cooperate any longer. The pain in his hips became totally incapacitating, forcing him to undergo double hip replacement surgery. The recovery was brutal and prolonged. For the first time in his adult life, he was forced off the road for an extended period. Lying in his bed, immobilized, the terrifying reality of his financial situation was finally laid completely bare. Without the massive daily influx of concert revenue, the elaborate financial scaffolding holding his life together began to violently collapse. The IRS ceased their quiet auditing and began issuing aggressive formal demands for payment. They began placing liens on his properties. The entourage, sensing the rapidly approaching end of the cash flow, began to quietly slip away, finding new, healthier celebrities to attach themselves to. Sammy realized that he had to get back on stage immediately, or he would lose everything he had spent 60 years building. Against the direct urge and advice of his surgeons, he forced himself into physical rehabilitation with a punishing, frantic intensity. He had to learn how to walk again on artificial joints, let alone dance. He pushed his body through agonizing pain, driven by the sheer, terrifying panic of bankruptcy. In late 1987, he miraculously returned to the stage, reuniting with Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin for a massive, highly publicized Together Again tour. The public narrative was one of a triumphant, nostalgic reunion of the legendary Rat Pack. The reality was a desperate, exhausting march for survival. The tour was highly lucrative, but it was physically devastating. Dean Martin, heavily addicted to prescription drugs and grieving the recent death of his son, frequently forgot his lyrics and eventually abandoned the tour entirely after just a few shows. Sinatra, aging and temperamental, was struggling with his own vocal decline. Sammy, powered by artificial hips and sheer willpower, became the heavy lifter of the entire production. He carried the shows, covering for Sinatra's forgotten lines and injecting his trademark energy into the fading act. He was performing brilliantly, but he was entirely running on fumes. By the end of the 1980s, Sammy Davis Jr. was a man who had successfully outrun poverty, survived violent racism, and conquered the global entertainment industry, only to find himself trapped in a sophisticated, inescapable financial prison of his own making. He was generating millions, yet he was effectively destitute, his earnings aggressively garnished by the government before he ever saw a single dollar. He had traded his physical health, his artistic dignity, and his emotional well-being to maintain the illusion of absolute success. The golden cage had stripped him of everything except his sheer stubborn ability to perform. But the system had one final devastating blow left to deliver. The ultimate betrayal was not going to come from a racist politician, a mafia boss, or a greedy accountant. It was going to come from within his own exhausted, heavily abused body. The tool that had kept him alive for 6 decades was about to finally, permanently break, triggering the most ruthless and revealing reaction from the industry he had given his entire life to serve. The brutal, unyielding momentum of the American entertainment machine finally ground to a halt for Sammy Davis Jr., not through a conscious decision to retire, but through a devastating biological ultimatum. In the late summer of 1989, a persistent, agonizing hoarseness took hold of his throat. It was a roughness that could no longer be attributed to the grueling touring schedule or the chronic, lifelong chain smoking. The medical examinations were swift, and the biopsy results returned with a cold, terrifying finality: carcinoma. He had developed throat cancer. The poetic injustice of this specific diagnosis was staggering. For a man who had survived the crushing poverty of Harlem, the violent racism of the segregated military, and the lethal threats of the Hollywood mafia entirely by utilizing his voice, this cancer was not just a physical disease, it was a targeted assassination of his identity. The disease had bypassed his exhausted artificial hips and directly attacked the very instrument that had purchased his survival since he was 3 years old. The medical establishment, operating with clinical detachment, presented Sammy with a stark, horrifying choice. The oncologists offered a surgical procedure to remove his vocal cords entirely. This radical intervention offered a high probability of eradicating the cancer and saving his biological life. But it came with an absolute non-negotiable cost. He would be permanently silenced. He would have to breathe through a surgical hole in his neck and communicate through an artificial voice box. For the doctors, it was a logical medical equation. For Sammy Davis Jr., it was a psychological death sentence. His entire framework of existence, his only proven defense mechanism against a world that had repeatedly demonstrated its hostility toward him, was his ability to sing, to mimic, and to command an audience. He possessed no concept of a life lived in silence. He reportedly looked at his medical team and made a decision that profoundly illuminated the depth of his conditioning. He refused the surgery. He effectively chose to preserve his voice over preserving his life. He stated quite simply that if he could not sing, he had no reason to be alive. His humanity was so inextricably fused with his utility as a performer that the prospect of existing simply as a man, entirely stripped of his audience, was a fate far more terrifying than terminal cancer. He opted instead for aggressive radiation therapy, a punishing, agonizing regimen that rapidly ravaged his already frail body. And it was precisely in this moment of supreme vulnerability, as the undeniable reality settled over Hollywood, that Sammy Davis Jr. would never perform again, that the most chilling phenomenon of his entire life occurred. The Golden Cage did not gently open its doors to release a beloved, wounded resident into a peaceful retirement. The operator simply turned off the stage lights, locked the doors, and walked away. The transformation of his environment was absolute and immediate. The sprawling, expensive entourage, the managers, the assistants, the bodyguards, and the perpetual house guests he had clothed, housed, and fed for decades began to vanish with breathtaking, ruthless speed. Without the constant, massive influx of casino and concert revenue, the extravagant payroll evaporated. The moment the checks stopped clearing, the synthetic family he had spent millions of dollars to purchase immediately disbanded, searching for the next profitable host. The profound, deafening silence that descended upon his Beverly Hills mansion was heavier than any physical pain he endured. The telephone lines, which for 40 years had rung incessantly with lucrative demands from Las Vegas casino bosses, powerful studio executives, and ambitious politicians, suddenly went dead. The men who used to embrace him in front of the flashing cameras, the executives who had grown immensely wealthy off the sweat of his brow, simply moved on to younger, healthier assets. Frank Sinatra, aging and dealing with his own complex twilight, was distant. Dean Martin, emotionally destroyed by the recent death of his son, was entirely unreachable. The absolute brutal pragmatism of the entertainment industry was laid bare in his living room. He was no longer a profitable commodity. He was a depreciating terminal liability. The system had never loved the man who bled for them. They had only ever loved the profit margins his talent could produce. Once the machine broke, he was instantaneously discarded. As his physical frame wasted away, dropping to an alarming skeletal weight of barely 60 pounds, an even more terrifying predator arrived at his doorstep. The bureaucratic machinery of the United States government descended upon his terminal decline with ruthless administrative efficiency. The Internal Revenue Service, entirely unbothered by his tragic medical diagnosis, his historic cultural legacy, or the decades he had spent fighting for civil rights, finalized their sprawling multi-year audit of his chaotic finances. The final staggering figure was presented to him as he lay dying in his bed. He owed the federal government an incomprehensible $15 million in unpaid taxes, compounding interest, and massive punitive fines. It is a number that defies logic until you understand the deep psychological pathology of his existence. How does a man who generated upwards of $50 million in a highly lucrative career find himself entirely destitute? It was not merely the result of negligent accountants, though they played their part. The $15 million debt was the literal quantifiable cost of the Golden Cage. It was the price tag of a lifetime spent desperately trying to buy affection, to numb the agony of racial isolation. He had spent millions purchasing custom Rolls Royces for strangers, to buy their smiles. He had thrown days-long catered parties simply to avoid sitting alone with the traumatic memories of the Wyoming barracks. He had financed an army of sycophants because he was fundamentally terrified that nobody would love him if he wasn't paying them to. He was a prisoner who had unwittingly financed the construction of his own incredibly lavish incarceration, only to be handed the staggering construction bill on his deathbed. On the 16th of May, 1990, at the age of 64, Samuel George Davis Jr. finally succumbed to the cancer. He passed away in his home, surrounded by a very small, quiet circle of genuine family, a stark, haunting, and tragic contrast to the millions of screaming fans and the thousands of standing ovations that had defined the entirety of his waking life. The brilliant, kinetic light that had captivated the 20th century was permanently extinguished. However, the tragedy of Sammy Davis Jr. did not conclude with his last breath. The American system had one final ultimate indignity to inflict upon his legacy. Because of the insurmountable $15 million debt owed to the IRS, his estate was not allowed to peacefully transition to his grieving widow, Altavis. Instead, it was immediately seized by the government and thrown into the cold, clinical machinery of probate court. The government ordered the complete and total liquidation of his life. Everything he had accumulated, the physical artifacts of his phenomenal career, and his desperate pursuit of validation, was dragged out of his home and cataloged for public auction. Items placed on the bidding block included his bespoke tuxedos, his solid gold watches, and his deeply personal photographs. The system systematically stripped him bare, relentlessly commodifying his memory and his history just to settle a bureaucratic ledger. He had literally given his entire life, his physical body, and his deeply bruised soul to the American entertainment machine. He had danced until his hips turned to dust. He had sung until his throat developed cancer, and he died owing the house $15 million. The life of Sammy Davis Jr. is not simply a biography of a legendary entertainer. It is a dark, devastating historical mirror reflecting the absolute ruthlessness of the society he sought to conquer. He danced his entire life with a desperate, burning intensity to purchase genuine love, but he only ever received a conditional, highly transactional tolerance. He was the ultimate tragic inhabitant of the golden cage, a man who was granted the illusion of immense power and wealth, while being systematically denied the fundamental right to simply exist as a free, unburdened human being. His spectacular rise and his devastating, lonely fall leave behind a profound, inescapable legacy. His story is history's most powerful, undeniable proof that an individual's extraordinary generational genius is utterly defenseless if the structural machinery that governs their existence remains fundamentally cold, racist, and extractive. The establishment celebrated the phenomenal entertainer, but they methodically, relentlessly crushed the man inside the tuxedo. In the end, the glittering neon lights of the Las Vegas Strip and the deafening roar of the global standing ovations were merely the beautiful, blinding illusions of a system that demands everything you have and ultimately forgives nothing.